For my last discussion post, I'm going to be doing prompt 1, Phyllis Wheatley, and prompt 2, Contemporary American Movements in Poetry. Prompt 1. According to poetryfoundation.org, Phyllis Wheatley was born in 1753 and died 1784. Wheatley was an African slave and taken from West Africa. Wheatley and other slaves who were considered unfit to work hard labor because of their ages or their bodies would not be able to handle the harsh labor were taken to the Boston docks to be sold. It was at those docks Wheatley would be sold to a family of 4. The mother and wife of the family were looking specifically for a petite, sort of weak girl. While the family did teach her how to read and write, they did take advantage of using Wheatley to do some domestic chores. Part of Wheatley's lessons were the teachings of the Bible, sciences, British literature, and Greek and Latin classics. While it was important for Wheatley's future to learn and be educated for a brighter future, the Wheatley family still had her do chores, and it was an unspoken way of saying, don't mistake your position in this household, especially since it was extremely uncommon for slaves to be educated, much less educated by the people who bought them, their masters. Wheatley's work, an elegiac on the death of that celebrated divine and eminent servant of Jesus Christ, the Reverend and learned George Whitefield, 1770, truly brought her commendations when published in a funeral sermon in London in 1771. At age 18, Wheatley had accumulated 28 poems, and with the help of Mrs. Wheatley, her work was promoted in Boston newspapers in 1772. Unsurprisingly, publishers denied supporting Wheatley's work because she was Black. Eventually, the Wheatleys sought the help of Countess of Huntington, a wealthy abolitionist, by sending the Countess the Whitefield poem. It was then the Countess told Archibald Bell, a bookseller, to help Wheatley with helping turn her work into a book. As Wheatley's work was really taking off, she started to use biblical symbolism and applied it to slavery. For example, Wheatley is best known for her poem, On Being Brought from Africa to America. This was meant to serve as a lesson of including Africans in the Christian stream. Wheatley's craft attracted the attention of George Washington, the first president of the United States, Thomas Hutchinson, a governor of Massachusetts, John Hancock, Oliver Andrew, etc. Another supporter of Wheatley's work was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Dr. Benjamin Rush. Later on, the Wheatleys were castigated, subject to severe punishments, reproof, or criticism, for keeping Phyllis with the slave status while also promoting her in London as the African genius. The Wheatleys countered these criticisms by declaring that while she was residing in the servants' quarters, that they never subjected her to any cruelty, and would ultimately have to Eventually, she would marry John Peters, have children, and would ultimately have to deal with fending for herself as her husband avoided creditors and would be looking for employment. Regardless of her unfortunate circumstances, Wheatley continued to work on her craft and publish her poems, to share her work with the world and to provide for her family. Wheatley died uncared for and alone on December 1784. I don't think that she is widely studied because history has always overshadowed women's accomplishments with the achievements of men, especially when it comes to the successes of colored individuals. Going back to how women's accomplishments are overshadowed by men, an example, more current era, is how the creator of the Harry Potter franchise, J.K. Rowling, her publisher asked her to use her initials as a marketing technique in order to have her work appeal to boys, because Rowling's publisher didn't think boys would read the series if they knew the books were written by a woman. I think it also has to do with Wheatley dying poor and alone. She came up with critically acclaimed work about religion, family, America, and still died alone and poor. Wheatley didn't hit the checklist for a success story, the kind of checklist from humble beginnings to widespread fame and fortune. Another reason I think Wheatley's work has been eclipsed is because of the time period she lived in. The civil rights movement wouldn't happen 200 years, almost 200 years after Wheatley's time. Buying slaves and treating African Americans as less than human was common and expected. Wheatley's work was a threat to the current way of life, having Black people under the heel of white people. A quote from Poetry Foundation website is that her name was a household word among literate colonists, and her achievements a catalyst for the fledgling anti-slavery movement. Prompt 2. Poetry Foundation stated in the 1920s to the 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance was in New York, specifically in Harlem. Harlem was a city known for being the Negro capital of the world, but it was not just a city with a population made up solely of African Americans. This was a cultural mecca, as described by History website. While the city of Harlem itself was only 3 square miles, the city was abundant with Black writers, intellectuals, artists, and musicians, as well as Black-owned businesses such as nightclubs, theaters, publishing houses, just to name a few. This made the neighborhood's popularity skyrocket. Harlem was about African Americans stepping out of the shadows of obscurity and stepping into the spotlight by reclaiming their identity and racial pride. In simpler terms, the Harlem Renaissance was like a giant middle finger to the injustice, prejudice, and bigotry experienced in the African American community. It was about taking a stand and expressing their creativity and capability through their craft, whatever that may be. For example, the poetic works of Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and Georgia Douglas Johnson. Their poetry delved into both the wonders and pains of being Black individuals. I think the reason poetry is important is because poetry is about articulating emotions, ideas, or even stories in a beautiful language that's meant to grasp at the minds and hearts of the readers. For example, Claude McKay's poem, If We Must Die, lines 1 and 2. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot. Lines 13 and 14. Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting. These 2 lines alone are similar to the saying, I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees, by Emiliano Zapata. I'm not sure if that's exactly the quote. When I was researching it, the quote itself was tweaked a little, but the message was still the same. McKay's poem could be described as a protest immortalized through the written word. He protested brutality, injustice, and racism felt towards his fellow African Americans through his poetry. Now for the 10 points extra credit, I am a poet. I named my poem Nonpareil. I got that word from dictionary.com and I liked it, so I decided to use it to title the poem. This poem was inspired by the poem I recited, Lucille Clifton's Won't You Celebrate With Me? So, Nonpareil. She's destined for greater things, unrestrained by what life brings, defiant against all self-proclaimed kings, eyes open, wings spread, looking forward, seeing what's ahead. No one can hope to tear her down, standing tall and strong, for whatever comes along. Watch her in admiration as she makes her declaration. Sharp teeth reach out to snatch, but you are no match. Thanks.